You very much, Chair Cantwell. Thank you, Senator Wicker, and thanks to everyone that's working on all of this endless frontier of issues. So I am very focused on manufacturing. My state is the state that brought the world everything from the pacemaker to the Post-it note. And one of the proposals that I have actually in a bill introduced with Senator Wicker, along with Senator Coons and Portman, focuses with the bipartisan companion in the House with Marcy Kaptur, focuses on an Office of Manufacturing and Industrial and Innovation Policy in the Executive Office of the President to help strengthen America's manufacturing industry. And I guess I'd turn to you, Mr. Bonvillian. In your testimony, you highlighted the importance of agency collaboration for technological innovation. Can you speak to the importance of federal coordination between agencies in developing measures to solidify U.S. leadership in scientific and technological advancement?
I share your interest and concern in getting a strong focus on manufacturing into the White House to coordinate the activities that are going on in the different agencies. In general, we've described, innovation as a team sport, and it truly is. And there's some issues that we need to address in this legislation to be sure that the bill tackles this in terms of coordination between agencies. One issue is that we need the coordination mechanisms set out between what this new NSF directorate is going to be undertaking and a series of advanced technologies with the other agencies that are already working on these territories, right? Obviously, DOD is doing a tremendous amount of work on AI, it's doing a tremendous amount of work on quantum.
Exactly.
We need to coordinate these pieces. And look, the US system is a very decentralized system for science and tech development, right? And frankly, that's historically been a strength of it. But there are times when you need to pull the pieces together and get them to act in coordination with each other. We have a hard time doing that with our decentralized agency system. One mechanism when we worked on nanotechnology was to create an office around that topic that the different participating agencies could join into and develop common strategies and share ideas across and make sure that they were understanding each other's advances in development. I think that kind of mechanism might be very useful in this bill in these different technology areas to assure that our agencies are pulling together and that what's been going on, what will go on at the new directorate will, enhance what's going on in some of the other locations.
Okay. Thank you. You know what I'm gonna do? Because I have such limited time, I want to ask a few other questions. Do you want to just say your second point in a few seconds here?
Linking to the Advanced Manufacturing Institutes is another important piece.
Okay, that's exactly right. Thank you very much. Dr. Shaw, workforce training, as I look at what we call I was just in Duluth, the mayor of Duluth said the lighthouse on the horizon, as opposed to the light at the end of the tunnel. With the ending of this pandemic, so much of this is going to be about, again, what because of the pandemic, but what we had before the pandemic, making sure we have people trained to do the jobs of tomorrow. As I often said on the campaign I ran about a year or two ago, that we're not going to have a shortage of sports marketing degrees in this country. We're going to have a shortage of plumbers, electricians, construction workers. Could you talk about making sure we're training people for the various skill levels of the jobs that we need and how we get there?
Thank you for the question. And it's spot on with things that we need to be considering as a part of the legislation that's being considered. Mississippi State University, for example, works very closely with the community colleges in the state, throughout the state of Mississippi, to be sure that we're addressing all of the needs in the state and not just in a particular area or a particular discipline. And the opportunity that we see, for example, with the program that we just created this last year through what's called a Bachelor of Applied Sciences, to be able to allow students to go down a technical track at a community college, but then to be able to have a new degree program that they can now move into as they are participating in the workforce, but now they're looking for a bachelor's degree to be able to advance to become a supervisor, to get a promotion. Now they have that track at Mississippi State. And this is a model by which we see the opportunity through that very close partnership to be able to address all skill sets rather than a particular segment.
And I know I'm out of time, and I'll ask this in writing, but I know, Dr. Miranda, you'd agree. Part of this is also advancing women, people of color, in getting into this market for the skills that we need. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. And I appreciate everyone's work on that. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Thune.
Mr. Chair, thank you to both of you for appearing today. And I'll start with you, Ms. Clark, because I have worked with you extensively on voting rights and other issues, and I know you appeared before our Rules Committee with Senator Blunt and I, and just did an excellent job. I want to thank you for that, and got respect from both sides of the aisle in terms of your testimony and how you answered questions. We know that we've had hundreds of voter suppression bills be introduced across the country since the last election. Could you briefly talk about your top priorities for voting rights when you get what I hope very much you will get this job?
Thank you so much, Senator. President Biden, Attorney General Garland have talked about the importance of the right to vote, and I will follow their lead in ensuring that the Civil Rights Division, if I am confirmed, is using the tools in its arsenal, the Voting Rights Act, the National Voter Registration Act, the Uniformed and Overseas Absentee Citizens Voting Act to ensure that eligible Americans have access to the ballot in our country.
Thank you. And I thank you for mentioning the families of both Daunte Wright as well as George Floyd. Obviously, these are tragedies in my own state, and my constituents have been through a lot with the murder of George Floyd, with the shooting of Daunte Clark, with the understanding that Daunte Wright, with the understanding that the word on in the news is there's going to be charges in that case as well today. But you also mentioned Officer Evans' family, which I appreciated. And I was someone who was at that memorial service yesterday, stood with the police officers as his body was taken for the last time out of the Capitol, right over the site where he was killed, was at the funeral of George Floyd. And I think you understand that you can both advocate for police reform and the rights of citizens and still respect deeply police. Could you comment about that and some of the things that you think we should be doing with police reform, which I strongly support, and I see Senator Booker is here, who's been such a leader on this. We appreciate that. Just how you can do both things at once.
Thank you so much for that question, Senator. I've not shied away, as a civil rights lawyer, I've not shied away from working with law enforcement. I needed to and relied on law enforcement to handle my cases as a federal prosecutor at the Justice Department. Hate crimes, human trafficking cases, domestic violence matters. That we could not move forward without the expertise and good guidance of law enforcement. At the New York State Attorney General's office, I worked closely with sheriffs, with the state police to investigate cases. At the Lawyers Committee where I am presently, we rolled up our sleeves and worked with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I think that there is a lot of common ground to be forged when it comes to issues of police reform and accountability and criminal justice reform generally. I appreciate that this role, leading the Civil Rights Division, is not a policy-making role, it's a law enforcement role. And I look forward to supporting the work of this body as it continues to wrestle with these issues and find pathways to progressive and healthy reforms.
Very good, thank you. And then I turn to you, Mr. Kim. I had a chance encounter with your sons, Paulden and in the hallway, and I see they're very well behaved behind you right now. And I would fill my other fellow senators in on, they spontaneously were able to recount several incidences from the presidential primary debates, which was quite impressive. Quite impressive. So anyone who is looking for, an advisor in the future, they're sitting behind Mr. Kim right now. We know that there were many issues of a lack of enforcement in the Justice Department during the last administration. 70% fewer Clean Water Act prosecutions, 50% fewer clean air cases during the first 2 years of the administration. And you've had some vast experience in this. And could you just take a second to talk about how you actually have worked for both the Bush administration and Democratic administrations, and you have served as a civil servant at the Justice Department under Republican, Democratic administrations. Can you talk about your history of believing in the Justice Department and its role beyond politics, and also how that will help you to do well in this job?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the kind
And
words
could you
about my
explain
son.
how your sons know all that stuff?
I can't explain that, actually. But I can say that if confirmed, what I really hope is to reaffirm the core values that the department has long stood for: fairness, independence, integrity, devotion to the rule of law. These values really matter to me, and it excites me tremendously to have the chance to return to the department and try to live up to those ideals. I have seen the statistics as well about drops in enforcement. I'm not at the department right now, so I can't speak to what's happened, at least directly as to any particular enforcement decision. But as Ms. Clark, I think, quite rightly said, this is not a policy role, this is an enforcement role. And so I want to make sure the rule of law is properly respected and that every enforcement decision is based on the facts and based on the law. And that's what I hope to do if confirmed.
Very good. I appreciate both of you very much. And I also appreciate the choice of your mom's school at the University of Minnesota. So very good. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Cotton.
Ms. Clark, was Officer Darren Wilson justified when he shot?
Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed. Aye. No. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith. Aye. Mr. Sass, Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Brasso, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio. No. Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Sullivan. No. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner. Aye. Ms. Baldwin, Ms. Baldwin. Aye.
We have 53 yeas, 45 nays. The nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Not objection? So ordered. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion on the nomination of Executive Calendar 53, Brenda Mallory of Maryland, to be a member of the Council on Environmental Quality, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Brenda Mallory of Maryland to be a member of the Council on Environmental Quality shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin. Okay, gotcha. Thanks. Coons, Emery, gotcha. Blumenthal, sir. King. Casey. Sanders. Kramer. Gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Mr. Carper. I did get you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, John, did you go down to a border with Henry? I did.
Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Ms. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer. Thank you. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper.
Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch. No. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson. No. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blumenthal. Aye. Mr. Young, Mr. Young. No. Mr. Hawley, Mr. Hawley. No. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines. No. Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Klobuchar. Aye.
The yeas, 53 votes. The nays, 45. The nomination is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Whip.
I ask unanimous consent the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection? Without objection, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 13, S937, a bill to facilitate the expedited review of COVID-19 hate crimes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S937, a bill to facilitate the expedited review of COVID-19 hate crimes and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
One votes yes.
I got you. I did get you. Sorry. Thank you. Aye, yes. Got it.
Do you have 2 minutes?
Amy, that was the tamest argument I've ever seen.
Yeah, aye. Gotcha. Thank you.
So what's your next motion?
Make Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey. Thanks. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Blackburn, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Burr, Carper, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Daines, Durbin, Ernst, Feinstein, Fisher, Graham, Grassley, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Hirono, Inhofe, Johnson, Kelly, Kennedy, King, Klobuchar, Lankford, Leahy, Lee, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Ossoff, Padilla, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Rosen, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Sullivan, Toomey, Warnock, Wicker, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Cotton, Hawley, Paul, and Tuberville. Mr. Brown, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Collins, aye.